It started with a locker that shouldn't have been hers. Sarah's fingers shook as she twisted the combination lock, a cold shiver crawling up her arms and down her spine. The hallway felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. Every step echoed against the linoleum, swallowed almost instantly by the silence. Then she saw it, a plain, unmarked envelope resting against her textbooks. Her name was written in sharp, precise letters, each curve unervingly deliberate, almost pulsing under her gaze. She tried to laugh, a hollow, nervous sound. A prank, she told herself. Someone's idea of a joke for the last week of school seniors. But when she unfolded the paper, her stomach dropped. The words weren't just congratulations, they were a warning. They described her death. The time, the place, the manner. Every detail, impossibly accurate, etched in ink that seemed alive. Each line pressed against her chest, cold and unyielding, and the hallway suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. Before we go deeper, like this video, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. In this abyss, stories don't just end, they follow you home. Sarah shoved the envelope into her backpack, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hallway seemed to stretch, the fluorescent lights flickering irregularly. She felt eyes, invisible and heavy, on her every move. Her heart pounded. Every familiar sound, the distant chatter from a classroom, the squeak of a locker, the shuffle of shoes in the hall, suddenly seemed unnatural. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination. Senioritis, nerves, stress, anything rational. But deep down she knew better. Something had followed her from that locker, and it wasn't done. By first period, small events began aligning with the note's warnings. A pencil rolled off a desk. A classmate tripped in a spot described almost verbatim. Every coincidence made her chest tighten further. She tried to focus, to act normal, but each glance at her backpack reminded her that the note was more than ink on paper. It was alive. She could feel its weight through the fabric of her bag, like it had a pulse of its own. Every step she took, every turn she made, seemed to echo the predictions. The world had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly, into something she couldn't explain, and it terrified her. At lunch, she opened her yearbook, hoping for a distraction. The familiar pages, the smiling faces, the casual scribbles of friends, everything felt like it belonged to another world. Then she turned to her own page. Her senior quote, once lighthearted and cheerful, had changed. In bold, clean letters it read, "Not everyone leaves this school alive." Her stomach twisted. The cafeteria seemed to close in, the air thick with something she couldn't name. Students talked and laughed around her, oblivious. Friends waved, called her name. But Sarah felt invisible. The envelope pressed against her side like a heartbeat she could feel with every breath. Every noise, every shadow, every glance made her question her own senses. Every step back to class was torturous. Hallways stretched endlessly, lockers looming, shadows twisting as if alive. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. The whispering began, faint at first, brushing against the edges of her consciousness, impossible to place, impossible to ignore. Soft murmurs she couldn't identify, indistinct syllables that felt like warnings or threats. She turned corners too slowly, too cautiously, hoping to see someone, anyone that could explain what was happening. But no one was there. And the envelope seemed to hum, to thrum against her ribcage, demanding attention, promising doom. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She could only move forward, step by hesitant step, carrying the weight of what she had read. The afternoon dragged. Each class, each teacher, each casual conversation felt heavy, almost surreal. The note's predictions began creeping further into reality. A spill at the chemistry lab exactly as written. A locker door left swinging by itself. Footsteps behind her that stopped whenever she spun around. Every small, ordinary accident became evidence that something was manipulating reality around her. Panic began to simmer beneath her chest, coiling tighter with each passing minute. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, but how could she explain something that sounded insane? The whispers followed her into the library. They were quieter here, brushing at the edges of hearing, teasing. She ran her fingers across the yearbook cover, tracing the altered quote again. Her hands were damp, trembling. Her breath came short, uneven. Every normal object, the books, the tables, the lights, felt wrong, imbued with tension, as if the school itself had changed while she wasn't looking. Her backpack thumped against her side with the note inside, and every pulse of her own heartbeat seemed to echo the warning, "You are being watched." As the final bell rang, Sarah walked slowly toward the exit. Each step felt like wading through invisible molasses. The whispers followed her, faint but deliberate, teasing and patient. Every flicker of light, every echo of her own footsteps reminded her that the envelope wasn't just a note, it was a countdown. She didn't know who had left it or why or what would happen next. All she knew was this: her graduation, the day she had long anticipated with excitement and joy, had become the first day of a nightmare she could not escape. And the nightmare had only just begun. After that first day, nothing was normal. Sarah tried to convince herself it had been a one-off, a fluke, an overactive imagination. But the envelope in her backpack, resting like a stone against her chest, reminded her it was real. Every corner of the school, every hallway, every glance from a stranger felt like it carried a hidden meaning. She had thought the worst was behind her, but the note was just beginning to weave its invisible threads. Her friends noticed her distraction, but no one suspected the truth. They teased her about being jumpy, about staring too long at empty corners, but Sarah couldn't explain. How could she? How could she tell them that a piece of paper knew things it shouldn't, that it predicted accidents, whispered warnings, and seemed almost alive? She moved through her routine carefully, clutching her backpack as if it were armor, trying to act normal in a world that had suddenly become hostile and unfamiliar. Every class felt longer. Every lesson a trial. She couldn't concentrate. Every minor noise made her spin, searching for threats she couldn't see. It started small. A locker door swinging open behind her with no one near it. A pencil rolling across a desk in a precise arc. Nothing she could explain rationally. At first, she dismissed them as coincidences. But when the same pattern repeated throughout the day, and each incident mirrored a prediction in the note, her mind began to fray. Panic crept into her chest, tightening with each heartbeat. She began imagining eyes in the shadows, figures lingering just out of reach, shapes moving in hallways she thought she knew. By the second day, the world itself seemed to obey the note. The cafeteria incident had been small, almost insignificant, but it was exact. A tray tipped over, spilling liquid in the precise pattern the note described. The chalkboard smudged in exactly the right spot. Even the air seemed different, charged with something she couldn't name. She began noticing patterns she had ignored before. The way the tassels on display caps swayed without wind, the way the fluorescent lights flickered near her desk, the way shadows stretched unnaturally at the edges of her vision. Every detail built on the last, creating a web she could not escape. Sarah's thoughts became relentless. How was this possible? Who could know these things? And if someone could, why? Each day she rehearsed escape routes in her head. Each hallway, stairwell, and exit became a potential trap. She imagined the note lying in wait in her backpack, alive, pulsing, dictating events around her. She tried to focus on mundane details, but they seemed to twist unnaturally. She could feel the eyes of something unseen on her back. Every sound, even ordinary chatter, carried a strange weight. The school was no longer familiar. It was hostile. It was alive. And it was aware of her. By midweek, the accidents were increasing in frequency and specificity. A chair tipped over just as the note predicted. A locker fell slightly off its hinges, creating a small, alarming crash. Footsteps echoed where no one had been. Sarah tried to tell herself it was coincidence. But when she found a small tear in her sleeve exactly described in the note, her resolve began to crack. She realized the envelope wasn't merely predicting events, it was shaping them. She was caught in its web, powerless, trapped. She tried to act normal around friends, but they noticed the change. Her laughter was hollow, her smiles delayed. Friends commented on her distraction. Sarah forced answers, shrugged off questions. They couldn't understand. No one could. How could she explain the creeping terror that followed her, invisible and unrelenting? Every glance toward the empty hallways sent a shiver down her spine. The whispers from the note seemed to follow her even outside class. They were faint but insistent, brushing the edges of her consciousness, warning her, threatening her, binding her to the predictions. Her backpack grew heavier with every step, the envelope inside pressing like a heartbeat against her ribs. Her chest tightened. Her fingers shook. The air felt thick, oppressive. Even her vision seemed off, like the corners of her eyes were seeing something she wasn't meant to perceive. Each minor sound, the scrape of a chair, the tick of a clock, the distant laughter of students, became amplified, ominous, a potential prelude to disaster. Sarah's nerves were taut. Every step forward was measured, careful, as though the world itself were testing her. And she knew, the note was winning. By Thursday, Sarah's fear had taken root in every aspect of her day. She didn't eat much, couldn't sleep well, and every quiet moment was filled with the echo of whispers and predictions. Her thoughts were consumed with the impossible. How could a note know her future so precisely? How could it predict accidents? How could it manipulate reality itself? The envelope in her backpack throbbed with a presence she could almost feel, like a heartbeat synced to her own. She realized the countdown had begun in earnest. Every passing hour edged her closer to the events written in the note, closer to a confrontation she wasn't ready for, closer to the nightmare she had no choice but to live. The school that had once been familiar, safe, mundane, was now a labyrinth of unease. Hallways stretched impossibly long. Shadows curled in corners that should have been empty. Every sound, every movement, every glance carried the potential for terror. And Sarah, clutching her backpack like a shield, knew one undeniable truth. The envelope had claimed her attention, her reality, her very sense of safety. There was no ignoring it. There was no running. The web had been cast, and she was trapped within it. The next steps, the next day, the next moments, everything would escalate, and she would have no choice but to face what the note had predicted. The abyss was closing in, and it wouldn't wait for her to be ready. By Friday, Sarah could no longer ignore the pattern. The envelope pulsed in her backpack like a heartbeat synced with her own. Every step she took seemed dictated, every movement watched. Hallways were narrower, shadows deeper. Even her friends, normally cheerful, seemed distant, voices echoing strangely as if filtered through water. Her world had warped, and the envelope was at the center of it all. Between classes she felt it, something moving just beyond her vision. A locker door slammed behind her, though no one was there. Footsteps echoed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. Every glance down the hall revealed figures that disappeared the instant she looked directly at them. She began imagining shapes in corners, lurking, waiting. But every instinct screamed that she wasn't imagining it entirely. Something was following her, and it wasn't content to stay invisible any longer. Her backpack grew impossibly heavy. Her arms ached from clutching it so tightly, yet she couldn't leave it behind. Her fingers shook uncontrollably. Her throat felt dry, as if the air itself had thickened. The classroom walls seemed to lean closer. Light flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows that twisted unnaturally. Every object in her path, the books, the chairs, even the floor tiles, felt purposeful, as if orchestrated to heighten her fear. The note wasn't just predicting events. It was reshaping reality around her, and she could feel the grip tightening. Every accident from the note intensified. A dropped pen rolled across the floor in the exact pattern described. A spilled drink formed an eerie puddle, reflecting the fluorescent lights in an unsettling, distorted shape. The tassel on the display cap twitched as if alive. Every minor event mirrored the predictions more precisely than before. Sarah's mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but rationality offered no comfort. She was trapped in a web she could not see, pulled by a force she could not name. The envelope, silent and heavy, whispered to her without words. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you stay in the school and try to figure out the truth, or would you run and never look back? Comment below. Your choice could make all the difference. Her thoughts tumbled in panic. Could she trust her own senses? Was this hallucination? Or had the note truly become a force, bending the world around her? Every hallway, every empty classroom, every glance at the shadows made her stomach knot tighter. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs felt heavier with every step. Her backpack pressed against her chest as if demanding compliance. She had no escape. Every rational thought was drowned beneath a tidal wave of dread. Every whispered echo of the note threatened to unravel her sanity. By mid-afternoon, the environment itself seemed hostile. The fluorescent lights flickered violently as she passed. Shadows moved in patterns that shouldn't exist. A sudden crash from the lab made her jump, even though no one else was there. Her reflection in the window looked wrong, delayed by a fraction of a second, like it was watching her instead of mirroring her. The envelope throbbed in her backpack, almost impatiently, urging her forward, forcing her toward events she didn't want to confront. The world around her had become a labyrinth of menace, each step a calculated threat. Her pulse raced. Her hands shook. Sweat slicked her palms as she gripped her backpack strap. The whispering grew clearer, almost articulate in tone. She thought she could hear her own name softly just behind her ear. Every creak, every distant footstep, every flicker of light was magnified into a signal of impending doom. She staggered to a hallway wall for support, pressing her forehead against the cool tile, trying to calm herself, but there was no relief. The envelope's presence dominated her consciousness. Every rational thought, every plan for safety, dissolved into fear. By the end of the school day, Sarah's sense of reality wavered. The halls were longer, darker, heavier. Every corner promised unseen threats. Every object seemed poised to betray her. The envelope's words had begun to dictate more than minor accidents. They guided shadows, orchestrated sounds, manipulated the world itself. And she knew, sooner or later she would have to face it. The unseen force behind the note was waiting. Patient, precise, relentless. The abyss was no longer distant. It was here and it was closing in fast. She had no choice but to step deeper into its grip. As she walked toward the empty auditorium, the only place she dared to gather her thoughts, every flicker of light and whisper seemed to sharpen, focusing on her. The envelope throbbed in her backpack like a living pulse. Her breath was ragged, her hands trembling violently. Every nerve screamed to run, yet a compulsion stronger than fear urged her forward. She didn't know what awaited her in that hall, only that it was inevitable. The countdown was near its peak, and the abyss, patient and cold, was ready to strike. Sarah's last chance to escape, or survive, was seconds away. Sarah stepped into the auditorium. The envelope pulsed in her hands, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. Every instinct screamed danger, but she could not turn back. This was the moment the note had led her to, the place where the nightmare demanded a confrontation. Her senses were on fire. The smell of polished wood mixed with faint metallic tangs she didn't recognize. The echo of her own footsteps sounded distorted, doubled, tripled, layering over itself. Every flicker of light created new shapes, shadows curling into impossible angles, morphing into figures that vanished when she looked directly. The whispers returned, louder now, articulate, a chorus of voices from nowhere and everywhere at once. She clutched her backpack, nails biting into fabric, trying to ground herself. Her chest heaved. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee. But the envelope had already claimed the stage. She had no choice but to face it. Sarah opened the envelope, hands shaking violently. The ink shimmered in the harsh light as though alive. Words twisted, shifting under her gaze. Predictions she had read before now seemed to move off the page, crawling like tendrils toward her fingers. The whispers escalated into whispers she could almost understand. "You cannot leave. Not yet." Her stomach dropped. She tried to drop the envelope, but it clung to her hands, almost magnetic. She pulled back. It resisted. Every struggle felt like pulling against fate itself. The auditorium walls seemed to pulse, breathing in and out with her panic. The seats stretched into impossible rows. Shadows twisted into figures, friends, strangers, entities, all watching, judging, waiting. Her ears rang. Her heartbeat thundered in her skull. Her vision tunneled. Every rational thought fled. She could hear the whispering voices naming events she had not yet seen, recounting her own thoughts before she thought them. A cold sweat slicked her hair and face. She could feel the envelope throbbing against her ribcage, a presence that was no longer paper, no longer ink, but something alive, something conscious. And then she saw it. Not a figure, not a person, not a stranger, but herself. Standing across the auditorium, pale, trembling, eyes wide with the same terror she felt. The reflection mimicked her movements perfectly, yet independently, as if a version of her had been trapped in the note all along. The realization crashed over her. The envelope wasn't predicting death. It wasn't guiding fate. It was creating it. The note had already claimed her future. Every accident, every misstep, every whispered warning was not a prediction. It was a blueprint, and she was the architect of her own terror. The abyss had mirrored her, and she could see herself in it. And it was watching. Her scream caught in her throat. The envelope spun in her hands, letters spinning, twisting, forming words she didn't recognize. The whispers crescendoed into a storm. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into a strobe of shadows and shapes. The air vibrated, pressing against her chest. Every step she tried to take felt like moving through water, slow and resistant. The figure, herself, moved closer, mirroring panic with precision. Every instinct screamed escape, but there was nowhere to run. The envelope pulsed violently. The abyss was here. It was alive. It was her. And it demanded acknowledgement. Sarah dropped to her knees. The envelope's thrumming intensified, resonating in her chest, in her bones, in her skull. Every whisper, every flicker of shadow, every impossible reflection pressed in, overlapping into unbearable pressure. Her mind raced, looping through every accident, every prediction, every whispered word she had ignored. She realized there was no undoing it. The envelope had rewritten her reality, threading her terror into the very fabric of the school, the air, the walls, and even her body. And the version of herself that watched, perfect and pale, mirrored her every movement, every flinch, every gasp. She could not distinguish self from reflection, reality from nightmare. And then it happened. The envelope floated from her hands, spinning in midair. The letters twisted into shapes she could feel, not read, shapes that pierced the air and sank into her mind. The reflection in the auditorium moved first, then she moved, perfectly synchronized yet separated. And in that instant, Sarah understood. The note had been alive all along, feeding, shaping, and amplifying her fears. She had stared into the abyss, and it had stared back, not as a shadow, not as a figure, but as herself. She was both observer and observed, victim and architect, trapped in a loop of horror she could not escape. The envelope collapsed onto the floor with a whisper, letters scattering like ash. The lights steadied. The shadows shrank. The whispers faded to nothing. But the auditorium felt heavier, charged with a presence she could not name. Sarah collapsed to the floor, trembling, heartbeat echoing, aware that she had survived the immediate terror. And yet, she knew the note's work was not finished. The abyss had not released her. It had only marked the first step of an ongoing nightmare. The envelope's imprint lingered in every corner, every sound, every shadow, a reminder she had survived, for now. Hours had passed since the confrontation in the auditorium. Sarah had forced herself upright, every step weighted with exhaustion, yet the invisible presence of the envelope seemed to cling to the air around her. Hallways she once knew now felt subtly warped, shadows stretching just slightly too long, corners lingering with an unshakable sense of being watched. Survival had ended the immediate terror, but the abyss had not released its hold. Her body ached from hours of tension, muscles stiff and joints protesting every movement. Sweat had dried into a cold film across her skin, but the shiver that ran down her spine was relentless. The envelope, though still on the auditorium floor, radiated a quiet, almost imperceptible presence that she could feel pressing against her mind. Each breath she drew reminded her that the battle was over, but the war within her consciousness had only just begun. Every sound, every movement, became an anchor of paranoia. The hum of fluorescent lights no longer felt ordinary, it vibrated with menace. Footsteps outside the auditorium sounded deliberate, echoing too long, too sharply. Even the distant laughter of students in the hallways made her skin crawl, as though it was filtered through some unseen distortion. Her mind replayed every whispered warning, every flicker of the lights, every impossible reflection, looping endlessly in the dark corners of her consciousness. Fear had become a permanent companion, threading through her reality. When Sarah finally returned to her friends, they noticed immediately that something was off. Her movements were jerky, her gaze darted constantly, her voice trembled ever so slightly. Questions poured out. "Are you okay? What happened?" But she could not answer. How could she explain the envelope, the whispers, the distorted reflections? Any explanation would sound insane. The isolation weighed heavier than the envelope itself. Surviving the terror had not reunited her with the world, it had placed her outside it. The envelope remained on the auditorium floor, untouched, yet its subtle presence lingered like a shadow over every hallway and classroom she passed. Tassels swayed without wind. Yearbook pages shifted slightly when she wasn't looking. The school appeared unchanged, but the familiar spaces carried the weight of the note's influence. Sarah walked through it as though in a dream, familiar yet alien, and every step reminded her that the abyss had left a permanent mark. Nights offered no escape. Every creak of the floorboards in her home, every passing car outside her window, every whisper in the dark reminded her that the envelope's influence had not ended. Even sunlight failed to wash away the tension. The words of the note, the impossible reflections, and the haunting whispers had etched themselves into her mind. Rationality could not touch them. The abyss was patient, and it had found a permanent home in her consciousness. Sarah tried to rebuild her normal life. She attended classes, smiled, laughed occasionally, but the world no longer felt real. Her hands still trembled occasionally, her pulse quickened at minor noises, and her perception of shadows had changed forever. Every interaction, every hallway, every ordinary sound carried the weight of what she had survived. The envelope had not only threatened her life, it had rewritten how she experienced it, leaving a residue of terror that no time or logic could erase. Months passed. Subtle signs persisted. Objects shifting slightly, lights flickering just out of the corner of her eye, shadows stretching longer than they should. She never opened the envelope again, yet its presence remained undeniable. It had marked her reality, threading fear into her very perception. Friends tried to assure her it had been a prank, a hallucination, or simple coincidence, but she knew the truth. The abyss had touched her life, and it was patient, waiting, watching. And so Sarah walked through the halls, through her life forever changed. The envelope remained a silent sentinel, shaping, whispering, watching. Every sound, every shadow, every ordinary moment carried the weight of the unseen. She had survived, but the abyss had not. You've just stared into the abyss, and the abyss has stared back. If these true stories kept you on edge, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on notifications because tomorrow the abyss opens again.